Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Neurodivergence and Personality Disorders in the FCFCOA, Understanding ASD and ADHD in Parenting Matters, which is part 2 in our two-part series exploring complex presentations in parenting matters and how they intersect with family law practice. Before we begin, I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today, and I pay my respects to all elders past, present and emerging. I'm dialing in from Sydney, so for me that's the Gadigal people, and I also extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. My name is Dina Palethorpe and I'm the coordinator of LEAP's new Family Law Forum. And as always, we're pleased to bring you practical, evidence-informed professional development designed to support you in your work with families navigating the court system. If you have any suggestions for future topics, please feel free to reach out and let us know. And don't forget to explore the other content available on our Family Law Forum. Today's webinar is being presented by Drew Cowan, psychologist and family report writer with the Relation Space. Drew's work spans both clinical and forensic contexts with extensive experience assessing and supporting neurodivergent children, adults and families. In today's session, Drew will cover what neurodiversity actually means, the key features of ASD and ADHD presentations in both children and adults, challenges in diagnosis, including gendered patterns, misdiagnosis and late identification, how neurodivergence may influence family dynamics, communication, decision-making and court participation, practical strategies for working effectively with neurodivergent clients, the other party and children, and the role of experts in evaluating parental capacity and recommending developmentally appropriate parenting arrangements. This session counts as one CPD point and will run for 1 hour, including about 10 minutes at the end for questions. So if you do have any questions for Drew, please feel free to use our Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen and we'll come back to them at the end. Finally, a recording of this webinar along with the webinar slides will be made available on the Family Law Forum after this session, and a copy also emailed to all people who have registered. Without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to hand over to Drew, who will begin today's presentation.
Thank you, Dina. And listening to that, I'm thinking, well, that's going to be interesting. I would love to hear about all those things. And I realised, oh, yeah, okay. Welcome to everybody. I, as a avid consumer of webinars, I realised that there'll be a range of attention levels. That's the reality we work in. So for those that are hanging off every word, thank you. For those that are kind of doing other things as well, hopefully I can pique your interest at some stage. Okay. Neurodiversity acknowledges brain function variations as normal, that is similar to physical trait differences. It's often used as an identity term and includes conditions like ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, and a range of other conditions such as dyslexia. Neuroatypicality is a broader descriptive term meaning not neurotypical. It can refer to any deviation from the typical neurological functioning, including temporary states, for example, a brain injury or mental health conditions. Okay, so just a kind of a pause. Many people consider neuroatypicality to be not a health condition, not a medical condition, and not a mental health disorder. They simply recognize that it is at the ends of a continuum, in the same way that height might be, some people are at one end of the height spectrum and some at the other end. At some point, we make an arbitrary decision that, well, okay, below this line or above this line, that's a condition. The difference between someone being one side or the other side of that line is negligible. There's no practical difference. But for convenience, we draw a line and we use that. So the same thing happens with intelligence. We're all familiar with the intelligence scales. To be diagnosed as having an intellectual disorder, for example, you need to be below a certain point on that continuum. Okay, so there's some inherent difficulties with considering neurofunctioning as a disorder because of the way autism spectrum disorder, for example, is diagnosed. There is an enormous variation. Knowing that someone has a diagnosis of ASD tells me absolutely nothing about that person. It doesn't tell me anything about their intelligence. It doesn't tell me anything about their needs. It doesn't tell me anything about them as an individual. It doesn't tell me anything about their support needs. So in the diagnostic world, we arbitrarily assign 3 levels referring to the support that someone needs. Level 1, meaning the person requires a minimal level of support, up to level 3 is substantial lifelong care needs. So they're fairly broad categories. They're mostly used politically, for example, with the NDIS. Different levels of funding are often applied to someone with a different categorization of support needs. So there's pressure often on assessors to allocate a level of support that's likely to attract funding for services and support that the person might need, leaving aside the political implications of that. Okay. There are enormous comorbidities between ASD and ADHD and other conditions. We know that for children, currently around 4.3% of 5 to 14-year-olds, this is Australian data, recent Australian data, around 4.3% of Australian children, 5 to 14, have a diagnosis of ASD. That's around 95% male. That is a huge gender variation. Now, the diagnosis of females, girls, is rocketing, but it's coming from a very, very low base. It's anticipated that in the next 10 to 20 years, the overall rate of diagnosis will increase simply because of the number of girls that are being diagnosed. And the same sorts of trends are occurring for the adult population. I'll get to that in a moment. Okay. For ADHD, we know that it's a very complex diagnosis to make, particularly for young children. So it's typically not made, and it diagnostically, there's real problems with making that diagnosis for children under 6. Often a diagnosis of ADHD is made once the child reaches primary school or the kind of years 3 and 4, because the schools identify that the child's functioning is problematic. So before then, it's often masked as normal childhood behavior or delayed developmental or maturation. But once the child reaches around year 2, year 3, then the schools typically say, well, hang on a second here, something's going on, and that stimulates a diagnosis. Okay. There's a huge comorbidity between ASD and ADHD, around 80%, or certainly some studies suggest up to 80%. Most are around 60, 70%. So a child with a diagnosis of ASD is very likely to have also a diagnosis of ADHD, or at least meet the diagnostic criteria, whether or not they have the diagnosis or not. Unfortunately, a diagnosis of ASD also has a very high comorbidity with other mental health diagnosis, around 70%. For ADHD, it's around 80%. If a child has a diagnosis of both ASD and ADHD, the likelihood of having another mental health diagnosis is around 90%. So they're huge figures, huge. All right. For ASD and for someone with ASD, a child with ASD, they are 4 times more likely than a child without ASD to have a diagnosis of depression. They're 3 times more likely to have a diagnosis of one of the anxiety disorders, typically generalized or social anxiety disorder. Okay. Girls are often misdiagnosed or not diagnosed, underdiagnosed, and it's largely because the presentation is very different. Boys typically have elements of hyperactivity and externalized behavior. So when they're dysregulated, the world knows about it. For girls, it's very often internalized. So when they're experiencing emotion dysregulated, they're suffering in silence. So for parents or particular schools, etc., it's easier to miss a girl who's struggling because she's not making a row, she's not disrupting others, etc., etc. We're kind of catching up on that now, and I think there's a greater understanding of the range of presentations, and there's a lot more education now for carers, teachers, and others to recognize emotional dysregulation in girls as well as boys. Okay. Just a note on diagnosis. One of the reasons that there's an increase in adult diagnosed, particularly ADHD, is that the diagnostic criteria has actually changed. When DSM-5 came out in May 2013, it was much more inclusive. It recognized that you could have ASD and ADHD, where previously it was specifically excluded. So that was a huge change. It also recognized that the presentation for adults looked different to children. There were some subtle changes around the age of onset that difficulties were noticed. It rose from 7 to 12, which I think was really important because it picked up a lot of those cases where parents were managing their child individually without much of a reference point. And it wasn't until the children got to school and then later on in school that the teachers became, very aware that this is not just an individual difference here. The child is really struggling and their understanding is very different to that of their peers. Okay. All righty. I'm rushing a little bit over the basic stuff because I really want to concentrate on the family law context and how it impacts on lawyers. So apologies, but all right.
Can
ASD
I
is
just while we're at this point, can I ask a question? So, is the presentation between ASD and ADHD and a child that has both different? So, a child that has autism and ADHD,
yeah,
are they presenting in a different way?
yeah. Many of the behaviors are common for both conditions. So prior to DSM-5, if a child met the criteria for ASD, they were given that diagnosis, and we weren't allowed to diagnose ADHD as well, even though the child met the criteria, it was excluded. All right. So there are lots of similarities. For example, the way that children understand what's going on around them, the way that they interpret data, black and white thinking, catastrophic thinking. They're often they can be very fixed in how they interpret what should happen. So they're very inflexible of thinking. Now, when I say there is an enormous range. All kids are different. So what I'm talking about is the common usual presentations. There will be some children with a diagnosis of ASD or ADHD that do not demonstrate those characteristics. They have a different set of stuff going on. But in general, there's the crossover or the commonality is in how a child understands what's going on for them socially and how they respond to that. They're thinking about it and their behavior based on those thoughts. So later on, hopefully I've given some examples that might demonstrate that a little bit more. All right. So ASD is characterized by persistent difficulties in social communication and interaction and restricted repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. So that's the kind of, that's the broad issues that we're dealing with. How that manifests individually is quite varied. Okay. So ASD, I mentioned the levels. All right. So the core features relevant to the legal context are first of all, communication differences. There may be difficulty interpreting non-literal language. So this is kind of for adults, but also for children. They may have difficulty interpreting non-literal language, understanding sarcasm, subtext. Their own speech might be highly literal. They may struggle with eye contact, which is often misinterpreted as evasiveness or lying, etc. Executive functioning is a common issue between ASD and ADHD. It does manifest slightly differently. So executive functioning refers to those planning, organizing, prioritizing, all of that kind of stuff that if you have it, life's a lot easier. If you don't, you're headbutting systems everywhere. Okay. So trouble with unstructured tasks, gathering complex documents, managing deadlines, or flexible thinking. How do we deal with competing tasks? I've got an appointment with my lawyer tomorrow. I need to have prepared for my affidavit, but I've also got this going on. How do I manage the two? Adapting to unexpected changes in the court schedule can often be overwhelming for someone with executive functioning problems. All right. Sensory sensitivities is the big one, and it's primarily for people with ASD. Over or under sensitivity to light, noise, touch, smell, you name it, someone can have difficulties with it. Not only overstimulation, but undersensitivity is also an issue. So the court environment, both the physical court environment, but also the family law court system is terrible. It's really difficult for most people when you have sensory sensitivities. It can be even more overwhelming. And I'll use the term overwhelming quite often because when someone is overwhelmed, their functioning decreases dramatically. There's a phenomenon known as the Yerkes-Dodson curve, which is a relationship between stress and performance. And in a nutshell, it describes increasing performance as stress increases until we reach a point where the performance plummets. So top athletes, for example, they operate at a very high stress level. The big game players. Once you get beyond that level of stimulation, your performance drops dramatically. We crash, the freeze out. So anyone who's crammed for an exam, or you'll know the closer it comes to the event, we tend to be hyper focused and get an amazing amount done. Okay, all right. So high anxiety and distress when routines are disrupted, when there's a change in anything. There's a misnomer or there's a misapprehension that people with ASD do not cope with change. my own view about that is a complete nonsense. Both my clinical experience and my personal experience is that that's absolutely nonsense. I think what happens is that they don't change, they don't tend not to cope well with unexpected change or kind of, sudden thrown in last minute kind of stuff. Most people with ASD cope absolutely fine with change, provided that they are sufficiently informed and supported, and that whatever needs they may have are adequately met. All right. Now, with ADHD, there are broadly three types. They call them subtypes or presentations. The one that everybody's familiar with boys is the kind of the hyperactivity. The one that is less obvious is the inattention, and that's the one that the girls typically have. And the third is simply the combination of them both, inattentive and hyperactive. Interestingly, the percentage of diagnosis changes over time and between jurisdiction. So in Australia, data's a little bit awkward on this, but it's around 40% hyperactive, 40% inattentive, and 20% combined. In the United States, for example, it's very much different. Now, that's got nothing to do with people being different, but it's got everything to do with how diagnoses are made. And anyway, ASD is reflected by a persistent pattern that interferes with functioning or development. It's how we think. In the same way that if I'm left-handed, I approach physical tasks in a different way than if I was right-handed. So some people are ambidextrous, lucky buggers. ADHD is represented by a clear difference in how thinking occurs, the cognitive process that occurs when people are confronted with stimulus. All right. In the legal context, inattention is a problem, focusing on detailed legal documents or the process. It's a complicated process that people find themselves in, and sometimes they have difficulty following that process. It's not a lack of desire or interest, but simply difficulty comprehending the scope of it. Attending to a long hearing or organising case-related materials, they can be easily distracted. Impulsivity occurs much to lawyers. Upset. Clients will often do things impulsively without first consulting with the lawyer, and it causes all sorts of problems. The most obvious example is responding to texts or emails, and I'm sure we've all had situations where if only, don't send it, write it, sure, don't send it. Impulsivity is a real hallmark of ADHD. Okay. Emotional dysregulation. Intense emotional reactions to stress, criticism, or perceived unfairness, and they may struggle to remain calm during mediation or cross-examination. So emotional dysregulation, again, occurs in many forms. The one that's obvious is when there's this external explosion. It's less obvious when a person is frozen, when they're internally paralyzed and not able to function. That's misinterpreted as all sorts of things: disinterest, inability, attempts to mislead. Yeah, much harder to identify and work with. All right, why does all this stuff matter to lawyers? Understanding neurodiversity can help lawyers understand the actions of their client or the other party and the needs of the child in the specific case. If you're not kind of understanding across neurodiversity, you may not be able to advocate effectively for your client or seek the appropriate accommodations for them or the child to allow them to participate effectively. And like any decisions, decisions require quality information. So if your client is not able to participate fully, they're not able to provide the information on which good decisions are made. Okay. It can also help us understand the complexities of family dynamics. And I've deliberately put in there that I think it's quite likely that lawyers are overrepresented in this group. My strong guess, I don't have any hard data, but my confident strong guess would be that lawyers would be overrepresented in both ASD and ADHD. Yeah. All right. All right. Strategies for your client. Um, they fall they fall across the same four categories that the diagnostic criteria focus on. Communication, adjustments, executive functioning, and how to support the client to manage their stress. It's equally as important, I think, to understand when we're dealing with other parties, to support your client in how to deal with their ex who is neuroatypical. Structured communication is really important. Having clear boundaries and rules around communication. It's also important to assist your client to focus on their ex's capacity rather than their intent. And I read a lot of affidavits where things are reported that are quite distressing and disturbing, but they're reported in such a way as assigning intent to the actions of the other party. From a psychologist's point of view, that's a dangerous area and one that I think we need to be really, really careful about. It's particularly difficult in the stress of a separated couple, where they're likely to know the other party pretty well. But I think if possible, it's to be avoided because it doesn't help resolve conflict and it doesn't help identify or meet the children's needs. And if there are concerns about an ex's partner, if there are concerns about your client's ex, then I think it's important to angle toward an independent evaluation rather than kind of, well, my ex is narcissistic or my ex is, they've got ADHD or whatever. So seeking independent evaluation, I think, is crucial. The earlier the better. All right. Strategies for kids. The best interest of the child needs to be seen through the neurodiverse lens. Now, I think this probably underpins my role or how an expert can assist the court in making assessments for children that are neurodiverse to help the court understand what's actually going on for them. Stability versus flexibility. Again, there's all these kind of stereotypes about children need stability and they're, not flexible, etc. That's true to some extent, but it's very individually driven. And typically what a neurodiverse child will benefit from is sufficient support to understand the changes and sufficient time to prepare and for whatever changes, etc. in preparation, I tried to find some information on shared care, equal time arrangements. Um, there wasn't a lot of information available, and what was available I thought was pretty useless. Um, when I It's common to address issues of shared care arrangements for kids that are neurodiverse, um, by focusing on what their deficits, or what they can't cope with, or what they're struggling with, rather than look more holistically as how can they best be supported, what arrangements or what changes can the parents make to better support the child to cope with whatever changes are being, considered. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. There's lots that can be done to help children, whether they be visual schedules or technological prompts, but getting it right at the beginning around what parenting arrangements are going to be beneficial is far more important than, trying to put band-aids on arrangements that are clearly not working for the child. All right. Um, Kids with atypicality tend to be more affected by conflict. All kids are affected by conflict. Kids with neurotypicality tend to be even more affected. There's a number of reasons for that, and it's largely to do with how they process conflict. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Alrighty, that's all the boring stuff for me. The role of the expert is really what I wanted to kind of get across today. Um, Assessing the child's needs, evaluating parental capacity, recommending optimal parenting structures, and providing expertise in neurodiversity or whatever the child's particular needs are within the family law context. Okay, so the issues for the single expert. When I'm working with a family, when I'm being asked to prepare, whether they be child impact assessment reports or single expert reports or single issue reports, whatever they happen to be, the focus for me is to help parents and the court better understand what's going on for the child and why. I want to start with a brief anecdote. Many years ago, when I was working internally in the family court, a young couple was referred to me, sent downstairs as they were in the day, and they were both really distressed. They had a 6-year-old boy who was absolutely determined not to spend any time with the father. They were an unusual couple in that they were both highly supportive of each other. They'd maintained an excellent friendship post-separation, and they were desperate for support in terms of, what's happening for the child. Why do they not want to spend time with the father? So quite unusual. The child wouldn't tell anyone. He would tell everyone that he didn't want to spend time with the father. He was scared of the father, etc., etc. He wanted to live with mum, but he wouldn't. There was no indication as to why. So I was working with this child for some time, and he broke down in tears and really distressed, and eventually said that his father wanted to kill him. So that kind of immediately, provided both an explanation and raised a lot of questions as to, what's going on here. Knowing what a child says is useless. It can be dangerous. It can be incredibly unhelpful. We need to know why the child is saying that. Without knowing why what they say can't help us in any way. Children will respond to adults questioning in a very different way to adults. If you ask an adult what happened with that bus crash in Adelaide today, they'll probably say, look, I don't know. I haven't seen the news. I don't know anything about it. If you ask a child, they will answer your questions. What colour was the bus? It was blue, the child says. They will answer questions based on their knowledge. It doesn't matter that it may be misleading. They'll provide information, and the connection between reality and fantasy is very blurred for children. They're quite happy to entertain Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, and adults not so much. But for children, getting them to talk to us is relatively easy. You ask them about stuff and they'll provide answers, but we need to know why. Okay. So for this little 6-year-old, it turned out that the parents were very young when they conceived. I think they were both 17. The maternal grandmother was quite a religious woman, and the young man at the time wanted to support his then girlfriend on this unexpected pregnancy, and he was openly offered to support her in whatever way needed. If she wanted to continue with the pregnancy, he would support her. If she wanted to terminate the pregnancy, he would support her. They had the child, and they were happy for a number of years and then separated. Shortly after separation, the 6-year-old was spending equal time with both parents, which was the flavour of the month, particularly for young parents at that time. And this went on for a month or so. Then the child became increasingly resistant and refused to spend time with the father. It ultimately came to be known that the maternal grandmother had told the child that the father wanted to murder him, and that if it wasn't for the maternal grandmother's intervention, the father would have been successful in murdering the child. Of course, referring to the father's option of a termination of the pregnancy. Once everybody knew that the child had that information, and typical of children, had internalized that information, it was easy to see why his sudden refusal and extreme refusal occurred. Less easy to manage it, but at least we had a pathway. We had a handle to be able to help the child, and help the parents to manage that. It stuck with me because I think it's a really good example of not just running with what a child says, but needing to understand what that is based upon. Children will internalize information, and they find it difficult to differentiate between things that they have directly witnessed and things that they have been told and things that they extrapolate. Adults kind of have an understanding of the differences, children far less so. That's even more so with children with neuroatypicality. They tend to internalize much more information that they are exposed to. And I mentioned before that kids with neuroatypicality tend to be more susceptible and more affected by conflict, parental conflict. And I think that's why. I think that's the mechanism. That's the reason why. Okay. Consider a family where one parent is neuroatypical. The roles are clearly defined and rigorously adhered to within the marriage prior to separation. Emotional issues such as planning and implementing social arrangements, including extended family engagement, typically managed by the parent who is high functioning with executive functioning skills. Routines highly structured and based on logic and fairness and predictable. When difficulties did arise, with interpreting social arrangements or the emotional needs of the children. Feedback and support was lovingly provided and accepted. The family functions, the children's needs are met. When the relationship's under strain, both parents feel increased stress. Executive functioning is reduced further. There's less tolerance for deficits, criticism increases, and support decreases. There's social tension, and the predictable household becomes far less predictable and safe. Following separation, tension is likely to be even higher. There's less tolerance for deficit and less support. Criticism increases. Communication becomes highly emotive and strained. Conversations find their way into affidavits and are used against the neuroatypical parent. Their previous strongest support is now actively opposing them. This is difficult territory. Interactions with children are all different. Times and places are different. The rules have not been established and refined. There's no one to soften difficulties with interpretations of emotional needs or social communication. It's difficult being a separated parent. It's really difficult being a separated neuroatypical parent. Communication with the other parent becomes a source of legal and financial stress. Reciprocal social communication has now got a whole lot trickier. During face-to-face changeovers, sensory overloads occurring, information is provided requiring an immediate response. Everyone is stressed with reduced functioning. Temporary changes in arrangements challenge the desire for predictability. Everything feels uncertain and unfair. The children are likely to be experiencing stress, and their emotional needs are likely to have increased as well. The parent is often required to undertake tasks that they have had little or no experience with. This is all occurring in new and frequently changing environments and circumstances. Did I mention that everybody was stressed? The parent is faced with multiple administrative demands, preparation for legal proceedings, the need to arrange or rearrange finances, housing, social events, balancing paid work and altered and possibly increased parenting responsibilities. This is really, really difficult. It's important to assess a parent's functioning within a time frame, within a context. And often affidavits and material is presented which shows poor functioning. It's important to understand what was going on for the parent at that time. It's important to understand the motives and the abilities of the parent. The parenting capacity is not fixed. It fluctuates over time. So where someone is under high stress in unfamiliar circumstances, etc., they're likely to make poorer quality decisions. Now, that doesn't necessarily equate to how they will parent on an ongoing basis once they've adjusted to separation and etc. So it's really important to understand behavior within the context. Okay. Consider a family where a child is neuroatypical. With a heightened sensitivity to tension, the child's likely to be aware of arguments and emotional volatility in the home. My parents are fighting, so everything is broken. Anxiety and perceived lack of control can result in an increase in restricted repetitive behaviours or an intense focus on special interests used as a self-soothing or avoidance mechanism. Black and white notion about conflict, including literal and catastrophic thinking. One parent must be in the right and one parent must be in the wrong. This is exacerbated by one parent moving out of the matrimonial home. It's often seen as a punishment for wrongdoing. Internal turmoil reduces executive functioning in a spiraling cycle. Caregivers may have less time and energy to support the child. Caregivers under stress impedes their own functioning and patience. The child has difficulty maintaining routines and managing social interactions. Following separation, there's a disruption to the home environment and the daily routine and an overall loss of predictability. The child may interpret a short-term absence of a parent as a permanent arrangement, triggering fears that the other parent will also suddenly disappear. So this is another example of what we refer to as black and white thinking or catastrophic thinking. If a child is transitioning between two homes, with one and sometimes both being completely new to the child, they must adapt to the new sensory environments, potentially resulting in sensory underload, overload, and fatigue. The child may struggle to understand that the rules and expectations in each home may differ, resulting in friction, behavioural outbursts, and a feeling of perpetual confusion or failure. The child may struggle to verbally express grief, anxiety, or confusion, and express their dysregulation behaviourally with aggression, defiance, shutting down, or regression in one or more areas of functioning. After the initial adjustment period, a child may experience loyalty conflicts, especially if one or both parents or other trusted adults speak negatively about a parent. The child may internalise the information, believing a parent is bad and developing rigid, fearful attachments. The child may feel compelled to take on an emotional support role, a form of parentification, which can be overwhelming for any child, let alone a child who already struggles to interpret and manage their own emotions. The long-term stress of managing two homes and processing the family rupture significantly increases the risk of comorbidity, especially anxiety and depression, which we know is already extremely high. All right. Lastly, I wanted to consider a family where one, but not all of the children are neuroatypical. So where one child is neuroatypical, a sibling is more likely to be neuroatypical than if they had a non-neuroatypical sibling. But there are lots of families where one child, but not all children are neuroatypical. Okay. All children are different. Good parenting is not treating all children identically. It's striving to understand and value the children equally and striving to meet their needs equally. Giving all of your kids ice cream is rubbish. Terrible idea. One of them might love it, one of them might hate it, and one of them might be dairy intolerant. So we don't want to treat them the same, but we want to meet their needs equally. The impact of separation may be felt unevenly across the family unit. The neurotypical child's distress is often overshadowed by the urgent, in-your-face, high-needs behaviour of the neuroatypical child. The neurotypical child may deliberately suppress or hide their own needs to avoid further burdening the parents. The neurotypical child is often used to doing this, for example, waiting for their sibling to get ready for school or transition between activities or recover from a sensory over or understimulation. A neurotypical sibling may take on a caregiving role for their sibling, particularly during transitions or at other times when the neuroatypical sibling or the parent is overwhelmed. Younger siblings learn from their older siblings. This is the normal way of things. A younger neurotypical child may consciously or unconsciously model and adopt externalizing behaviors as a learned mechanism to finally gain parental attention. So it's often difficult to identify in a younger sibling what is learnt behavior and what is an innate characteristic of that child. Two households mean two sets of rules. Inconsistent behaviour management and reward systems across the homes lead to the child's symptoms being exacerbated and behavioural problems being reinforced. Siblings are often hypervigilant when a sibling gets away with behaviour that they themselves would get into strife for. There's fertile ground here for perceptions of favouritism and denigration of one parent by the other. Now, it is far less common, but it does occur, and we need to be mindful that a neurotypical child may develop a resentment or an impatience towards their neuroatypical sibling. The neurotypical child sees separation as a way to get a break from their sibling and to enjoy resources, attention, and material benefits that they'd previously missed out on. The neurotypical child may actively create and encourage disharmony and seek to amplify distress. Yeah. When two parents live together in a supporting and loving relationship, they can work together and support each other, including one parent often dealing with the urgency of the neuroatypical child. But when a parent's on their own, it's much more difficult to keep all the plates spinning. Parenting on your own is tough. Parenting on your own with a neuroatypical child is really tough. All right. So I want to finish briefly with some co-parenting issues. All right. There's often high conflict surrounding a child's behavior and functioning. Parents differ over what's normal and what's not. A neuroatypical parent, whether they're diagnosed or not, may not consider the behavior of the child unusual, let alone something to be treated. The complexity of the child's needs requires frequent, detailed, and emotion-free communication. This is a challenge that high conflict separated parents often cannot meet, directly harming the child's well-being. One parent typically assumes the role of expert or primary therapeutic parent, managing all the appointments and liaising with schools, etc. Now, when the family was intact, that kind of worked well, no problem. But when the parents separate, this often leads to an imbalance of power and potential resentment from the other parent. All right. And I would be remiss of me not to mention the question of assessment in relation to ADHD and medication. It's really common that a parent who has been struggling with their child's behavior or functioning more broadly has wanted the child assessed, and the other parent has been resistant to that. It hasn't happened. Once they separate, the parent rushes off to get the kid assessed. The temptation is really high to exclude the other parent. They never wanted this assessment in the first place. They've actively resisted it for years. Although that temptation's there, it's not a good idea. It's often very unhelpful. High quality assessment requires high quality information. It's important that it comes from a range of sources. Unless there's a reason not to, sometimes there is. It must include information from both parents as well as schools and others, as well as the clinician's direct engagement with the child. Certainly as a single expert, I'm always eager to see subpoena material of the assessment process, not just the assessment report. I want to know how the clinician arrived at that diagnosis or not. The perceptions of each parent is really important. I want to know how the assessing clinician has, if they've got information from both parents, how they manage any significant differences from each parent. Equally, I'm always concerned when an assessment is made without the benefit of all of the stakeholders. All right. Once a child is assessed with ADHD, the question comes up, do we medicate or do we not? And there'll often be strong differences of opinion between the parents. The parent that wanted the child assessed will want to medicate. The parent, is nothing wrong with the child, certainly not in my care, won't want medication. There's no right or wrong answer to this. It does cause enormous stress between the parents, and the process needs to be managed well. Pediatricians, psychiatrists will differ on their views about medication, and it's common that a parent will access a specialist who has a view that is consistent with the parents. If the parent wants medication, they'll go to a clinician that prescribes. If the parent doesn't want medication, they'll find a specialist who doesn't prescribe. This is a huge issue. The only thing I want to say is we need to manage the process of disagreement carefully. And often there'll be a judicial decision, not necessarily on whether we medicate or not, but decision-making responsibility. And should that be shared, or should one parent have that, at least in relation to the health issues of the child? Alrighty. I think I'm out of time.
Yeah, I think you are. We've had just a few questions come in, and I guess in your experience, and talking more maybe about ASD here, but how often do you see children masking? So, child is with mum and mum reports, they have tantrums, they're
Yeah.
always difficult when they come back from dad, and then dad says, "Oh, child is an angel for me. There are no issues on my end. It's all mum's fault." Is that a common thing that you see?
Yeah, look, really common, and not only in the context of family law or separated parents. Masking is a huge issue. Um, the common situation is the child will go to school and bust their boiler to try and do the right thing, not get into trouble, follow the rules, get along with others, etc., etc. It's exhausting. So they come home and they're horrid because it's just exhausted. They come home and kick the dog. They come home and that's their safe space where they can be themselves and they don't have to mask. We see it often where a child is living predominantly in one household and spending um, much less time with the other parent. They can hold it together, if you like, with the other parent. It's almost like they can try really hard and manage to regulate their emotions enough. But again, when they get home, there's lots of, particularly when the issues for the child are different in each household, when the rules are different in each household, um, such that it impacts on the child's sense of self, or sensory stimulation, is a common one. Um, the child will be fine in the overstimulated environment, but it's exhausting. And when they're out of that and they're at home, or they're in a place where they feel safe and can relax, they'll often bust.
Great. So I've had just one other question. So, when assessing a neurodivergent child's best interests, what factors tend to be overlooked or underweighed in family law proceedings?
Yeah. Um, I I think the common stuff are around um, sensitivities and what's calming. So all children have ways to calm down, ways to self-soothe. And one of the goals of parenting is to assist our child to self-regulate. For neuroatypical children, they tend to require more self-soothing, etc., because they're coming across situations that are dysregulating. So there's more need for them to be able to self-soothe. So what's overlooked, I think, is the absence of what the child's used to in terms of self-soothing. And it might be objects, or it might be a physical space, or access to a pet, or whatever the child finds helpful in their self-soothing. It might also be a lack of transition time. So it's very common that neuroatypical children will require more transition time between activities, between places, etc. So after school, I come home, I just need 15, 20 minutes of chill time. Then I can rejoin the world. Moving from a household to a very different household often requires a level of calm down time. And I think that in assessments and in the family law process, the child doesn't get that. So the way the child behaves is misinterpreted. There's incorrect assumptions made about why a child is behaving in a certain way. And where parents are in conflict, the obvious is to jump to, well, it must be the other parent who has told you to do this or say this, or when nothing to do with the other parent and the child's just trying to adjust to very different regimes.
Oh, well, okay. Thank you so much for that. So thank you, Drew, for such an informative session. I have taken so much from that. And, it's invaluable information. For all our members, thank you for joining. This was the last webinar in our series for November. Probably the last one for the year, but we're going to try to create some content for you. So just remember to keep checking the forum to see what we post. And thank you so much to Drew, and thank you so much everyone for dialing in today.